you can use my PowerPoint if you're interested in this article, but as was mentioned, I've written about this in different capacities. I just did a book on it with several case studies. I also have done a report on the implementation of Article 33 for the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which dates from 2011, and I'm currently updating. And I have provided advice to several states on implementation, so I did both research and practice on this issue. What I want to say is that my main focus is Europe. It's already very broad for me, so pardon me if my examples mainly come from that region, but I think that during the responses we have examples outside of Europe. So I find this, everything that concerns Article 33, which I call national structures for the implementation and monitoring of the Convention, a very passionate area and important for different reasons. One of the things is that when a state ratifies the Convention, one of the first things it will do is to find a solution or solutions to implement Article 33. And what it will do at that time, the bodies it will designate, the mechanism it will create to ensure the participation of persons with disabilities will have a huge impact on the implementation of the Convention afterwards. Because this mechanism will facilitate the implementation of all the articles of the Convention we have discussed earlier. So it's very important that this is done well and this works. Otherwise, the implementation of the Convention might be seriously delayed. Now, just to discuss this article, I cannot just focus on its different provisions, although I will do so. But I need also, from time to time, to take a step back and to understand from where it comes, what is the broader context to which bodies have served as inspiration for the different parts of Article 33, although of course my main focus will remain the content of this article, and I will also try to come with different examples. A last thing is that, as was announced earlier, I will from time to time between the different parts of Article 33 stop, and if you want then you can ask questions. I will come myself with examples, but if you have anything at the end, and maybe if you have a comment or an example you want to share, do this. You can do this as well, but please do this then at the end, not during the different question times during the presentation. Oh, I did a mistake. It's not finished, don't worry. It was the wrong button, just to test your attention. Okay. So, what are we talking about now? We are not talking about substantive rights, like inclusive education or legal capacity. As you saw already this morning, we are talking about all these mechanisms that ensure that the Convention is turned into practice. You can call this monitoring and implementation mechanisms. And as you during in the UN framework, so the CRPD is a UN treaty, we see that for the last 20 years there has been a lot of attention to the issue of implementation. As what was said by a former Secretary General, we need to move from the area of legislation to an area of implementation. And why is this? Because we have seen, especially for instance with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that there have been a lot of treaties with very good goals and good ideas, but the implementation of the ground is not so good. So this is why implementation is important. And as you know, as far as the CRPD is concerned, the question of implementation was in everybody's mind, even during the drafting. And as we saw earlier, some people spoke about an implementation convention. The idea was to better understand human rights and to specify and tailor them to persons with disabilities. So the aspect of implementation was an important issue. And we see this also as far as the implementation mechanisms are concerned. We have spoken about the international monitoring mechanism. Now we'll go a level closer to the local level, which is the national level. And as you see, I took this quote from Jack Donnelly: the struggle for human rights will be won or lost at the national level. The national level is very important. It is not to say that we need, of course, international mechanism to exercise control on the way in which states fulfill their commitment. But it is at the domestic level that human rights will be implemented or will not be implemented. So the convention needs to be domesticated at a national level. And it's important that organizations of persons with disabilities, but also other organizations, take this, appropriate and take this convention and use it in their daily work. So the idea is to close this implementation gap about which I was speaking earlier, and this is why we have such an elaborated provisions for the implementation and monitoring of the convention. So now let me first very briefly present you Article 33, and then I will speak about the different provisions. So I will then also quote the articles, unless you have them now. So if you have them, please take Article 33. But as you will see, and as we will see during this presentation, there are 3 paragraphs in Article 33. In the first paragraph, the first paragraph concerns focal points and coordination mechanism. This is the state level. So the administration, those that are responsible for taking measures for implementing the convention. In the second paragraph, we have a paragraph on independent mechanism, or a framework including one or more independent mechanisms. There's a kind of we'll come back to this, but there's a kind of new actor between state and non-state actor that have the responsibility to internally monitor what the state is doing to fulfill its commitment regarding the convention. And in the third paragraph, we have a special emphasis on the role, or more precisely, the participation and involvement of civil society in the monitoring process. So this provision is very remarkable, and I think we will discuss a bit more about it, the drafting in the response, because it is not only comprehensive, there are different aspects covered. You call them a kind of national human rights architecture with the different bodies that are necessary to implement the convention. But it's also very clear, 1, 2, 3 different actors, 3 different perspectives, 3 different roles, which we'll see during this lecture. However, there are also very complicated aspects, because it sounds beautiful on a PowerPoint, but at the state level, in the field, things might be completely different. And so you might need to adapt bodies' behaviors to make sure that they are as close as possible as what is proposed by Article 33. And for instance, for the participation of persons with disabilities, there can be, it should be integrated in the whole, in all these bodies, but how you do this can be complicated. The fact is also that often states have already different bodies that are responsible for disability right policies, and the question is, how do they fit in this structure proposed by Article 33? I have a little problem, as I feared this is not my last version. There is one slide missing, it's not the one of yesterday. So I will ask you, I have 2 questions now for you, and I will ask them while we work this out. Is it not?
Okay.
Is it possible?
Yeah.
Okay, so So don't worry. You will have to answer my questions, but you will not see them immediately. So why do we need national structures for the implementation and monitoring of the conventions? So why are these so important? I already highlighted a few issues. That's my first question. And then my second question, what do you think are the most important aspects of these structures? If people tell you we need structures to implement the convention, what are the first things about which you will think? Anybody? Yeah, please.
I hope it's okay that I can answer your first question.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, here we go.
You initially stated that anything relating to the convention can be won or lost at national level.
Yeah.
It's very important that at the national level there's very strong structures that ensure that the CRPD is respected and implemented at the greatest level. So I think it's important then that at national level, because it usually is the very strongest starting point for the implementation of the CRPD.
Yes, very good. If I can add to this in very simple words, it's important that a convention does not become an empty declaration. It should do something with it and not just sign it for appearance or window dressing. Yeah, please.
I think maybe it would also help to have homegrown solutions.
Yeah.
To implementing the CRPD, especially because we have different contexts in which these conventions really play out. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, indeed. It should become, that's why, for instance, participation is so important in this mechanism. It should come really from the ground, and the goals of the convention should be not only translated into national policies, but also be confronted with national problems and national concerns.
And implementation needs different bodies and players to carry on as obligation of it, and to organize and decide who is supposed to do what and how to do it needs also to have some legal framework inside the country.
Yeah. If you want to climb a mountain very high, you need a very good team and be organized. That's why this is important. You need to have a good coordination. Yeah, please.
I think there is a fundamental question we need to look at it. Specifically, the nature of the legal system of each country in terms of incorporation of international human rights treaties and standards within the national law. And here I think we need to look at whether your system is a monist or a policed. And I think this is a really serious problem in some countries, because if you incorporate directly the CRPD, you need to implement it, make it applicable, and this actually might cause some problems with regard to law enforcement officials, because they are not really trained in these areas. And if you want to adopt the other system to harmonize, this might actually cause conflict, because the process of harmonization between international conventions and national laws is a very technical issue. So it is really problematic, and I think this is the first question we need to answer with regard to incorporation of international treaties within the national laws.
Yes, a very important aspect. I will not discuss this further, so it's very good that you highlight it. And it concerns also Article 4.1 about implementation and adoption of legislation. And it's important that those, especially the focal points responsible for this, are aware of these aspects, and that the harmonization process takes place as soon as possible. Yes, please.
Regarding your second question, I would highlight three aspects. The first being independence, the second being sufficient funding, and the third being having sufficient investigation rights. So establish duties to state authorities to provide actually information to these structures when asked.
Yes, thank you very much. That this indeed concerns rather so, especially the second part, the national bodies. And we will speak about resources. The resource question is something very sensitive for the implementation of a treaty. Where do you have to put priorities and how you need to use your resources in the best way possible to progressively realize a convention. But one thing is certain, it's that if you want people to deal with the convention, to monitor, you cannot do, but need resources to do this. But this can have a multiplier effect, of course, on the convention. But without resources, it is simply not possible, as far as Article 33 is concerned.
For the second question, probably goes without saying, but I would also say that inclusion of persons with disabilities themselves.
Yes, and that's the most important, and we will stop here, and I will continue, and that's the most important aspect, and I will really try during now my whole presentation to really show that that's one of the major aspects, and Article 33.3, which concerns in particular the participation of persons with disabilities, should not be seen in isolation. It's something which underlies the whole national structures for the implementation and monitoring of the convention. So we have already, I see you're very aware of what I will tell you, which makes me very happy, and so I'm sure we have a much more interesting questions since you know a bit where I'm heading to. Let me now go to the different parts of Article 33. So I will discuss them one by one, leaving time for some questions, and then I will come with two examples. I choose these two examples of two countries. That you see the whole architecture of two countries, and not just separate bodies for one or another country, from one or another country. Okay, now let's start in the more technical and aspect of Article 33. The first of one says that state parties, in accordance with their system of organization, shall designate one or more focal points within government for matters relating to the implementation of the present convention. So, as you see, let me use the technology, we see the word shall, so people have to designate such a mechanism to fulfill their obligations. This, although this is new as far as international human rights law is concerned, we don't find this in other treaties, but for the rights of persons with disabilities, you already find something similar in the UN standards rules. So there was already a precedent as far as persons with disabilities are concerned. As you see, it's one or more focal points, so there is some flexibility. You can appoint several ministries, and that's even a good idea, to ensure that they all be involved in the implementation of the convention. But you need, of course, kind of head focal point that has a major responsibility for the implementation of the convention. To do what? Next question. We discussed in detail today the state reporting. So when these focal points are appointed, one of the first things that we will have to do, and this will be a first exercise, a kind of internal assessment, while most of them just take it as an exercise before the UN CRPD committee, the idea is also to for the first time coordinate and have an overview on what is missing as far as the implementation of the convention is concerned. So the first thing is the state reporting that they will do. Of course, it should not stop there. In practice, we see that often after the designation of the focal point, there's the state report, and when the state report is submitted to the UN CRPD committee, then people just wait and are busy with other activities. So what should they do other than the state reporting to the committee? It's to take measures to implement the convention, to define which steps, which legislation has to be changed to make sure that it is in compliance with the requirements of the convention, to develop and to implement disability rights policies in the light, again, of the convention. And there we have it, as well ensure the participation of civil society. And we all heard about Article 4 paragraph 3, which requires that persons with disabilities are involved in the implementation of the convention, and we will talk about it again when I'll speak about the third part of Article 33. It's important that in one way or another they are consulted, they are involved in all the initiatives taken by the focal points to implement the convention. And we'll see, this can for instance happen, take place through advisory bodies where representatives of the POs are sitting and can give their opinion on initiatives taken by the government regarding legal capacity, inclusive education, or other rights provided for in the convention. We will see, although that as far as these advisory bodies are concerned, I will come back to it, sometimes it's difficult to know where exactly they belong in this Article 33 architecture. But as you see here, one way is to create them or to have bodies that can, in particular, advise the focal points. Last point, the contact. The focal point should be a contact point, and not only at the national, but also at the international level. At the national level, it's important that any department, at whatever, it can be also at a very local level, local government, can ask for information or help regarding the convention. So within the administration, it's important to have one phone number or one department to whom people can go and ask questions. And the same holds for DPOs, that DPOs, disability organizations, know to whom they can address their concerns if they have a question or they want to share something, that they don't have to look at who is responsible for that matter. That's something which the focal point should look for them, and it should be able to answer to their questions. And also for the people in general, and that's why it's, for instance, good to announce, although it's no obligation to provide it by law, who will be the focal point, but to announce that department or these people are the focal point, so that people in general know who is busy with the convention and who is taking care of its implementation on a daily basis. But also at the international level, it would be impossible if the committee has to address recommendations or deal with a complaint, because as you know, the committee, if states have ratified the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, individuals can file a complaint to the committee, and then the committee will go to the state and ask questions and share this communications and ask explanation. So it's important that there is one person and the committee knows to whom he should address this communication. The same holds for other organizations, that if they need information for a report or if there is a complaint, there are different mechanisms at the regional and international level. There is one person or one unit that these organizations can call to be sure that you have the right answer. Article 33, paragraph 1 also provides that state parties shall give due consideration to the establishment or designation of a coordination mechanism within government to facilitate rated action in different sectors and at different levels. As you see, shall give due consideration. So it's not an obligation this time to create such a coordination mechanism. Can you then just ignore this? Okay, I'll give consideration to it, we don't need it, period. No, you need to consider it, and if you don't want such a coordination mechanism, which is possible, you have to show that it is not necessary to have such a mechanism. I went, so for instance, to a country, Malta. They asked me to provide advice on this aspect, and I saw that all the ministries were sitting in the same building and working on common documents and common policies on a daily basis. It was not necessary to add another body, another mechanism, because it would just create structures which are unnecessary. But for many other countries, and especially federal states, as I will explain later, there such a coordination mechanism might be required, especially since it has to know to facilitate coordination with the regional level. So it's an obligation, and as I said, there is vertical and horizontal cooperation, by which I mean vertical between ministries, so to be sure that ministries do not take isolated measures. So the coordination mechanism can ensure that Ministry of Justice is involved in legal capacity issues, Ministry of Education also involved in inclusive education and so on, or housing, etc. And also the horizontal level, the vertical level in federal states, as you know, and we saw, sometimes the regions have important competences, and often focal points or ministries would not have any power regarding this regional level, and then important to have a coordination mechanism to be sure that to ensure coherence in the approaches and to avoid gaps in the implementation of the convention. So the idea of this coordination mechanism is to have a platform to facilitate decision making, and also, again, to ensure the participation of persons with disabilities in particular. Because since this coordination mechanism has broad networks, it can also ensure that persons with disabilities are consulted when the decision-making processes are going on. Now, I'll give you a bit of practice. So how this is taking place in reality. But first, just how long is it? 12:30. Okay. So what I see, at least in Europe, is that in most countries it is ministries of social affairs or similar kind of ministries that have been appointed focal point. Is this bad or good? Very difficult to say. Most of the time, this kind of ministries have been busy with disability issues before the ratification of the convention, and the fact that they are now focal point means that we have to focus on the CRPD and carry out disability policies that comply with the CRPD. So they will have often to change their approach, take a distance from the medical model and come closer to the human rights model. This can be complicated. So it's a pity, there are very few that did that, but it's a pity that no ministries of justice have been more involved or be designated as focal point. Often the reason is that these ministries have been very involved in the negotiation of the convention and are already, as I said, taking care of disability issues, so that was a simple way to do it. As far as the coordination mechanisms are concerned, often they are also, the states appoint the focal point, also coordination mechanism. Again, this can be no problem if you can demonstrate that the focal point is also capable of ensuring coordination with other ministries, but having a distinct coordination mechanism, as we will see in the examples, can also be beneficial to distinguish the functions of the focal point on the one hand and the coordination mechanism on the other hand, which is more creating a platform where information can be shared and facilitating decision making in collaboration with organizations of persons with disabilities. Last point, and a very interesting thing that we can see in practice is the creation of subfocal points. And as was discussed earlier, several states, including mine, Belgium, have regions that have important competences regarding persons with disabilities, such as education. And I see more and more that in federal states, a big part of the issues that relate to the convention found the competences of these regions, because it concerns a particular group of persons. And we see that education and employment is often dealt with by this regional level. So several states have then appointed subfocal points, and I think this is very interesting because this avoids an implementation gap. Human rights and disability rights are often, people think that this is mostly the concern of the federal level, because human rights human rights refer to international human rights conventions, and forget that actually the most local level is often also if not more concerned by the implementation of these conventions. So the importance of the whole Article 33 is to have a global approach and to see where the gap lies and where you can choose the people and the departments that can have the greatest impact on the implementation of the convention, either in centralized states within the different ministries or in federal states, taking into account the competences of the regions. I'm finished with Article 33.1. What I propose to do is to go on with Article 33.2 and then 3. And before my examples, then I will leave some time for questions. So if you have questions about this, please wait. I will just go to the whole article and then I will stop before coming to my examples. So now we have the most important part of Article 33. It's the independent mechanism. And Article 33.2 reads, state parties shall designate or establish a framework including one or more independent mechanisms as appropriate to promote, protect and monitor implementation of the present convention. Establishing or when designating or establishing such a mechanism, state parties shall take into account in full principles relating to the status of national institutions for the promotion and protection of human rights, in short, the Paris principles. So, I think if you read this provision, everything is in there, and I will explain what it involves, but every word counts. I think it's very well drafted because every aspect is important. And I will explain first what are the possibilities, then what are these functions of promotion, protection and monitoring, and then I will also briefly explain what these Paris principles are. So, as with Article 33.1, there is some flexibility as far as independent mechanisms are concerned. But this flexibility goes even further because states can designate or establish mechanisms. So they can choose. They can either say, we will designate you, X body, to do the job, or we see that nobody can do it and we will create another one. So the idea is to see what exists and in function of that, either designate or create a new mechanism. Designation does not mean, as often happens in practice, okay, you're a nice ombudsman, now you will do this. No, you will have to adapt either the structure or provide additional funding. You cannot just designate without taking any measures to be sure that it is compliant with Article 33.2. You can do sometimes, but in most cases you will have to adapt it slightly to be sure that it complies with the provisions of Article 33.2. Second aspect, you can have one or more independent mechanisms. That's very interesting as well. Either you can, because as I said in the beginning, the institutional landscape varies from one state to the other, and so you might discover that the different functions of this independent mechanism are, for the moment, shared or taken care of by different bodies, and so you can appoint these different bodies to be sure that you cover the whole mandate of the independent mechanism. So this is the newest element here, and the most original element in this convention. It's a kind of, what are these independent mechanisms? And if I can summarize it, it's a bit like a watchdog that is looking in your own garden to look what you are doing. So that's a bit what these kind of bodies are. You create an internal monitoring body that will tell you when you have crossed the red line. And it's not the first time we find this in a treaty. This is inspired by a similar experience which has differences, which is the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, where we have national preventive mechanisms that can visit places of detention. But I think in the response we will hear more about this. So this is not the first time we have such bodies, but here they have a quite broad mandate because they have to cover all the convention, and there are also different functions, which I will discuss now. So, what should they do? And as you see on my PowerPoint, there is a lot that they should do. So the functions are very broad. If I start with promotion, you saw in Article 33 that there is here promote, protect, and monitor. So promotion includes a lot of things. Raising awareness by disseminating materials, training, education within the formal, the school sector or university, but also outside of it, for people that all people that are in contact with persons with disabilities or whose action affects the implementation of their rights. Research, promoting the understanding of the CRPD within the national context, disseminating it. So it should be, it's very broad and it's very important because, as you know, the first thing to be sure that is necessary to implement the convention is to combat stereotypes and to share the values of the convention. But it should be said that promotion is not only the task of independent mechanism. As you know, in Article 8, states have also the obligation to promote the convention, and often DPOs also promote the convention, so there is a kind of a shared responsibility. So this independent mechanism have to see where they can fit in this story to avoid duplication by focusing on the convention, possibly raising new issues or problematic issues. You can also use the media. It's very important how to use the media to promote the convention, and again to combat stereotypes and to help to change the image the public has on persons with disabilities. Second function, protection. What is protection? Protection is taking action to when a person, the rights of a person with disabilities are infringed, are breached, and this can take place throughout different kind of actions. The most known of it is complaints handling. So this mechanism receives a complaint about a child that has been refused reasonable accommodation in normal school, or there can be complaints about minority accessibility, and then it will mediate. And to do this, it should have certain powers, we said it before, quasi-judicial powers. It should be able to get information to call people that are responsible for this issue. But protection is also broader. It includes amicus curiae, which means providing information during a legal process, so going to the judge and explaining the convention to that judge, which is very important because we see that often the judiciary does not know much about the convention and there's still the medical approach in mind. This can happen at the national and the international level. The national level is very important for the judges, but also, as happened in Europe before the European Court of Human Rights, when there was a case concerning persons with disabilities, to provide information to the judges that they understand the situation and can take a right decision and be informed. But also assistance, legal assistance, strategic assistance to persons who want to claim their rights before courts, and if possible represent the victim if that is necessary. Then the third function, monitoring, that's the broadest one and the most innovative one, which in this concerns to make sure that the convention is implemented, to follow up the implementation of the convention through the evaluation of policies and legislation and their compatibility with the convention, to provide opinions on sensitive issues. Very important to promote the collection of data, maybe not collect the data by themselves, because there are other institutes that can do that, but to be sure that it is coordinated and that this takes place, and possibly having indicators which can determine whether or not progress is made in the realization of the convention with the data that has been collected. Inquiries, especially on issues that are not seen at the surface, like in psychiatric institutions. And then follow up not only of the commitments of the states, but for instance also of the concluding observations of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So this is very broad, and just to tell you, it can create problems because it's too large and it's not possible to do in 1 or 2 years. So this priorities will often have to be made, and at the same time there should be a strategy, but also some flexibility to seize opportunities when a new law is passed or when a new issue is raised within the media. But inevitably choices must be made, and as we will see now, that's important why this body is independent and can make these choices without any political interference. Just a little discussion to continue what we discussed this morning. This independent mechanism can also have a role in the state reporting process at different stages. Most of them write what we call parallel reports. So we heard about the shadow reports, which come from DPOs, but they often can write a commentary of our report, which is an answer from their perspective to the state report. It's a bit between the two. It's not a shadow report, it's not a state report. This is very complicated. It's a new type of report. The problem is that it multiplies the reports before the committee, but most of them do so, and I think it is useful because it provides kind of additional information to the state reports, which can help the committee in reaching its concluding observations. But even more important than that, as we see, for instance, in Germany, they can be involved, as I said, in the follow-up of the concluding observations of the committee. And as we see, often states receive these concluding observations, they put them somewhere in a roof or put them aside, and 4 years later they come with another report saying that they had no time or whatever. So it's important that states are not let off the hook, and that somebody is continuing the work of the committee at the national level to be the extension of the committee at the national level. And there they have an important responsibility to make sure that to urge the state to take steps within a reasonable time period to implement these recommendations, and also to create a discussion about them, raise awareness, so that the work that has been done by DPOs and by the committee is not done for nothing. And I think we have already now this kind of practice is evolving, and I think and I hope that with the concluding observations of the committee they will seize the existing independent mechanism will seize this opportunity. So now we go to maybe the most important aspects of this independent mechanisms, which are the Paris principles. As we saw that in the Article 33.2, states have to take into account the Paris principles when establishing or designating such mechanisms. So what are these Paris principles? These principles were drafted by what we call national human rights institutions. And these are, if I may say, independent mechanisms, so like the independent mechanism in Article 33.2, but that should promote and protect all human rights. They exist already for a few decades, and it's especially in the 90s and the years 2000 that a lot of states have created this kind of institutions. And in 1991, they have adopted guidelines that explain what they should do and what are the criteria to qualify as a national human rights institution. And as we will see, these guidelines, these Paris principles provide, amongst others, that they should be independent and pluralistic. So we have this paper, these Paris principles, which you can find on any website, for instance on the website of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And it's important to know that not only they were not adopted but endorsed by the General Assembly and the former Commission on Human Rights, but that there is also an accreditation process by these national human rights institutions themselves, which gives an A, B or C status according to the full, partial or non-compliance of these institutions with the Paris principles. So there's it's like with the milk, there is kind of or biomilk is a kind of label. But it's a label given by these NHRIs themselves. What do these Paris principles say? The most important.
Can you clarify this?
Oh, sorry. Clarify? Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Accreditation.
Yeah. Okay. I'll clarify it, but the problem is that if I want to talk about national human rights institutions, I can speak a whole day. So I will, but I have a lot also documentation on it, which I can send to you. So the accreditation means giving to those bodies that pretend to be national human rights institutions a status. So the status can be A, B, or C. A means full compliance, B, partial compliance, and C, non-compliance. So who gives that to these bodies? Well, it's the NHRIs themselves. They form what is called an international coordinating committee of national human rights institutions, which has a subcommittee on accreditation, and NHRI send their documentation to this international coordinating committee, which afterwards gives them this A, B, or C status. And in Europe, or we have now in the world, I think 62 institutions that have such an A status. Is this okay?
Yeah, but is it mandatory for every country in NHRI to
apply for the accreditation?
It's not. That's a good question. Very good question. No, it's not an obligation to have a national human rights institutions. But since the 90s, we see that many international organizations, treaty bodies, strongly recommend states to have such institutions. And now that we have these principles in the CRPD, the status of these national human rights institutions, the legal status, is even stronger. So I can say it's not neither yes or no, but almost yes. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Oof, the clock. Well, thank you for your question. So, independence, creation by... What is independence? The criteria are to be created by law. Why? Because when your mandate is in a law, you cannot change it overnight if you are not happy with your independent mechanism. No governmental involvement. As I said earlier, you need to be able to choose your priorities, your staff members, and your strategy by your own. And, very important, funding. Without funding, this cannot work. Or if you have to find funding elsewhere, you will depend on the one who is giving you the money. Pluralism. What is pluralism? Again, as we said, participation of the persons concerned by the implementation of human rights, in particular civil society organizations, including NGOs, but also other organizations like professional organizations and academics and experts. Very importantly, if governmental departments have their representatives somewhere in these organizations, they shall have no voting rights. So they cannot say, we want this recommendation, or they cannot have an impact on the outcome or on the opinions produced by these national human rights institutions. I will not go further into this. What I want to say, however, is that we have to read these Paris principles in the light of the convention, of course. So, for instance, civil society should be read as organizations, civil society organizations that are protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, like DPOs. So you have to read this in the light of the mandate that this independent mechanism should have, which is to promote, protect, and monitor the implementation of the convention. I will not go into depth about this, but there is a lot of discussion if these Paris principles are enough, because it's beautiful to be independent on paper, but what about the effectiveness, the accountability? There are different projects going on these questions. I can tell you about it, but I will not go into depth, discuss this into detail now. What I want to do, however, is to say how it happens in practice. And in practice, we see that there are very different solutions. And one of the most known is, of course, NHRIs. So these national institutions have often been given the mandate, and the reason is very simple, is that since the Paris principles are mentioned in Article 33.2, they are what I would call the best pedigree for being independent mechanisms. But sometimes it's also equality bodies, like in my country or in France, and it's interesting because it's a non-discrimination convention, so they have also a good experience. Or ombudsmen, who have a lot of experience in handling complaints, like for instance in Poland, sometimes advisory bodies. And as I said, these advisory bodies have created a problem in the Article 33 structures, because states have given them the role of independent mechanism, but they cannot play fully this role, because they may provide advice to the state, but they do not protect and monitor the convention. So we see that the mandate is not fully covered if these bodies are involved. And there is also another problem, is that often governmental representatives are sitting on these advisory bodies with voting rights. So it's more a platform to provide input for policy making than a monitoring body. You have also other bodies. We'll speak about Austria afterwards. For instance, in some countries people started from scratch because there was nothing, and they created new bodies which just fulfill the role of independent mechanism. So that sounds very nice and easy, but it's more complicated in practice for two reasons. It's that a lot of bodies have different functions, and I recently discovered that in Poland, the Polish human rights defender has the function of national human rights institution, equality body, and ombudsman. So some people fall on the different categories. And the other thing is that you can create more than one independent mechanism, so some people appoint different bodies. So in the end, you have no model. Every country has its own solution depending on what bodies it had before ratifying the convention. Last but not least, civil society, in particular persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, shall be involved and participate fully in the monitoring process. I don't need to remember you that one of the main key issues in the convention is nothing about us without us. And this started during the negotiation of the convention, has found its way in the convention, amongst others in Article 33.3, and should continue during its implementation. So it's important that civil society is involved in the implementation process. And what is very interesting about this provision, it works like a hammer. It's not to be seen in isolation, but it's a hammer on every other provision of the convention and any other part of Article 33. So it should be seen in combination, and it should strengthen the participation aspect of the different provisions of Article 33. So I'll explain what this means here. If you read Article 4.3, which provides for the participation of persons with disabilities in implementation of the convention, and you combine it with Article 33.3, it provides for the participation of persons with disabilities through the focal point and the coordination mechanisms. And as I said, the advisory bodies, which I think fit better under Article 33.1, are a very good practice here to ensure that they can participate in the monitoring and implementation of the convention. As far as independent mechanisms are concerned, there you have a combination between the Paris principles, so which provide for pluralism, and Article 33, which stresses the participation in the monitoring function. So the Paris principles are broader. You have seen that it sees civil society as a broad category, but here you have a big stress on DPOs. And there are different ways to involve them, either to have the disabled people organizations represented on the boards of the independent mechanism, or to allow them to appoint people in this mechanism, to have persons with disabilities themselves involved and running these independent mechanisms, or to have a close cooperation with this organization by having platforms, steering committees of persons with disabilities to which this independent mechanism turn before making their recommendations. Very important last point is that persons with disabilities should also have the capacity to monitor outside any of these structures, because it might be that they do not work or that the outcome is does not live up to their expectations, and then it's important that they can also choose another way to make their claims. So, as you see, there is a lot of overlap as far as Article 33 is concerned. But what is the most important is that there are different channels through which persons with disabilities can make their claim, and they should see where they can have the strongest impact. It might be that the independent mechanism is not working, or it might be that for one policy the focal point is closing the doors, seeing where it can have an input and also follow up any decision-making process until a decision is made. Another important aspect here, but that concerns the whole Article 33, is to ensure that there is coordination between these bodies, because of course in the advisory bodies there will be organizations of persons with disabilities, and it's important that people know who is saying what, not only to avoid contradictions, but also surprises or mistakes. So an important coordination in this whole framework, especially as far as DPOs are concerned, is very important to have a strategy and to know to which body you are saying what, and to have the information at the right time. So I have now two examples, but I propose, now I will leave 5 minutes for questions, if possible, questions about the content of Article 33. And then I will discuss 2 examples to show you the variety of possibilities states have to create these national structures for the implementation and monitoring of the Convention. So are there any questions? 1, 2, 3. Okay, excellent.
Regarding paragraph 2, how would you describe the relation between the independent mechanism and the framework that needs to be established?
Yep.
Would you have examples on how these frameworks work in some countries?
Yep.
Thank you. My question is about the funding. From which governmental institution it's more better to be funded such monitorings, and what practices shows about funding for monitoring processes? And also one specific question, especially from my country, from Georgia, it's about what measures can be taken when service providers use convention, and especially Article 33 for their own interests, creating such bodies to make governmental programs flexible on their sides. So in that case, there is broad gaps between average citizens and NGO sector and government, citizens and media. So the disabled people are losing the quality for services when service providers are using Article 33 for their use, for their interest to say. Thank you.
Sorry, just to be sure, is the second a question or is it just a comment? The question is about service providers.
What measures can be taken in that case when there are arguments about non-competence from PVDs themselves to participate in monitoring process from service providers?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a last question. After that, I'm afraid I will have to answer.
My question is, how effective the national focal point should be? Because if I were to...
Can you speak louder, please?
Yeah, how effective the national focal point should be? Because in India, for example, we have a Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, which has only a small capsule, which is known as Department of Disability Affairs. So can we say that this fulfills the mandate of Article 33? So how the focal point must be effective? What is the degree of effectiveness, number one?
Okay.
And number two, to what extent the national focal point must be represented by persons with disability? Can we say that the focal point issue would be addressed effectively if we have a distinct ministry addressing the issue of disability, instead of having a small department in the ministry?
Okay, thank you very much for these questions. I will reply briefly because time is almost over. So, framework and independent mechanism. So, yeah, it's a tricky question, and thank you for reminding me because it's not in my presentation. So, I think we are still, and that's my conclusion, we are still on the way to give a meaning to many of the terms of Article 33. And the only way to give a meaning to them is to see how it happens in practice and make an evaluation. So, so far, what I think, but there are other versions, and I'm sure they are defendable, is that the idea of the framework is either to have different mechanism or to have one mechanism but adapted and that is a framework because it cooperates, like yours in Germany, with DPOs, etc. And the setting forms a framework. But the basic idea is, however, that you can have different elements, and then an essential question remains: should all these elements be independent mechanisms? And in the Spanish version of Article 32, it is the case, because it's not the word including, but made up, for instance. So there is a controversy, and I think they should be all independent, because you cannot monitor if you are not independent. As far as that was so your question, but it's important. I try in my work with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I try to give a meaning to that, so you can find information about it in that report. Funding. Of course, yeah, that's, as I said earlier, if you want to promote the convention, if you want to write advice on the implementation, if you want to do events, it's not possible to ask somebody to do this without giving him the resources to do this. This is not possible. So funding for monitoring, it is time-consuming monitoring. If you want to review legislation, if you want to participate, it's time-consuming. So there should be a minimum of resources to be able, maybe not too much in the beginning, but there should be a minimum of resources that is even provided for in the Paris Principles. Service providers, thank you very much for this question. Very sensitive again. I don't have the truth, but if I read the Paris Principles, I see that professional organizations should be involved. So, in a way, although they are concerned, they are concerned with, they can be part of the wrong implementation of the convention. They should be involved there, but I think that the most important is that the major actors, as far as the monitoring body is concerned, is disabled people organizations. Others might be there, provided they are not part of the government, but they shall not be excluded, especially not in the independent mechanism, because their role is provided for in the Paris Principle. They should not be the main actors. As far as effectiveness is concerned, I fully agree with you, and thank you for raising this question. A focal point, what is effective? It's not always a matter of number of people, and planning. It's often a matter of right choices, choosing the right people, putting the priorities, being able to listen to organizations, and having a single ministry of different monies. It really matters. The idea is that there is a focal point and that it mainstreams disability rights with the other ministries. If it's a single ministry of a unit, I don't think that's the most important aspect. So, I think I have very little time for my examples, and I will not do them. I will just show you the slides and say two things. Here you will have them at your disposal. I have Denmark for you, and in Denmark we see that we have, for instance, 3 independent mechanisms. And there you see that they have shared different functions. They have even a council here in the independent mechanism, which stresses the participatory aspect of the independent mechanism in the framework. So there you have the Article 33 hammer that is included in the mechanism. I think it's a good practice. And also the ombudsman, which reinforces the protection mandate. And we have also a special coordination mechanism. Next, Austria, I can talk you about, very interesting as well, because you have this here, an advisory board, which helps the focal point, and you have also sub-focal point, that's very recent, which mainly focus on education in collaboration with the main focal point. And they've created a new monitoring body, which exactly follows the Paris Principles, the only problem being that it has very, very little resources with a broad mandate. So, and also no super-independent mechanism, so you have a kind of symmetry. My last slide, the most complete monitoring system ever in an international human rights treaty. So at the same time, it's very clear, but it's very complicated, as you see, and I don't have the answer to every question. The important is that we don't read the provisions in isolation. sorry, and that it serves to accelerate the implementation of the conventions. I would say that, and that answers to the question of the gentleman from India, it's one thing is you need structures to climb the mountains, to have a good team, and that's the purpose of Article 33, but you need also oil in the motor, and they need some goodwill and effectiveness. So what is on paper is not always good in practice, and vice versa. Leadership, effectiveness, collaboration are all very important to ensure that it works. A last thing is that you never reach full. I think you will never reach full compliance with Article 33. What is very important is to have a continuous evaluation process of what you are doing, and I hope the committee in the future will help states to improve their independent mechanism. And as I said, Article 33 will only get sense with practice, with re-evaluation, adaptation, and I think it's a very beautiful provision because it's not static. There is no full answer. It's a dynamic provision for which to understand you need to look at practice and see how you can make improvements within the bodies and with the participation of persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank you. You've been very passionate, and I think again have engaged with an article that is quite in depth and presented in a really good way. And I think thank you very much for that. And you obviously very much like your subject. So I think in terms of the last 30 minutes, we have 2 PhD students who are going to give a response. So first is Meredith Raley. Meredith has received a BA in Political Science from the College of Charleston and a JD from Northeastern University School of Law in 2010. And she's currently a PhD student at the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, and her PhD is focusing on Article 33. And I know that Meredith has a timer in front of her, so she won't take her time.
Like Mary said, I'm doing a PhD here on Article 33, and I'm particularly interested in why Article 33 has taken the form it did. So I'm going to try to give you some background information on what the situation was at the UN at the time, and what kind of trends led to the creation of Article 33 in particular. So Gauthier already talked about how starting in the 90s, when the Paris Principles were drafted, national human rights institutions began to increase in number hugely. And at the same time, as the UN adopted the Paris Principles, the UN recognized that national human rights institutions were a kind of body separate both from state governments and from NGOs. And this benefited the national human rights institutions because they gained this kind of special status at the UN in the early 2000s, which meant that by the time the CRPD was being drafted, they were viewed as such a separate and unique body. They were able to negotiate separately from their state parties and separately from NGOs, which gave them much more power than they normally would have, and more power than they had at previous draftings, which is why they were able to kind of gain a special place for themselves in Article 33.2, with its implicit mention of the Paris Principles. The other big trend that led to the Article 33 was, as was mentioned, the National Preventative Mechanism in the Optional Protocol of the Convention Against Torture. The National Preventative Mechanism was revolutionary in several ways. It was the first time the Paris Principles were mentioned, although interestingly, states were not required to follow the Paris Principles. They were only asked to keep them in mind. So it's kind of almost a lesser standard than you found in Article 33.2. It was also the first treaty to require a domestic monitoring body. This body is laid out in far more detail than the body in Article 33.2. It's given several articles. It runs from, and its exact duties are laid out. The exact extent of its power is laid out. There was, as I will go over, some talk of doing something similar in the drafting of CRPD, but the reason the National Preventative Mechanism could be laid out in so much more detail was that it was in an optional protocol, which means it had far less reach than the CRPD. The optional protocol has been ratified by 63 states. Of those, 44 would go on to set up a national preventative mechanism. So you can see that compared to the CRPD, while it was a far more detailed body and in some ways a more powerful body, it's also simply has far less reach than the CRPD would have. So, and it still, however, set the precedent that the NGOs and national rights institutions were able to use to push for a monitoring body within the CRPD. During the drafting also, the other trend you should be aware of is the drafting took place at an interesting time for the UN. The UN had, starting in the 1990s, been undergoing a process of reform. There was, at the drafting, a clear awareness that past human rights treaties had not been complied with as widely as they should have been, and that the mechanisms that were used to monitor and implement conventions were clearly inadequate. So there was, at the time of the drafting of the CRPD, a clear kind of an openness to change and innovation that hadn't been present in other conventions, which allowed, again, many of the NGOs, the national rights institutions, and a few states to really push for a change that led to Article 33.2. The national mechanism was in place from the very first draft. The three parts, the focal point, the coordination mechanism, and the monitoring mechanism, were already in place. However, the monitoring mechanism was not yet formed out. It was not described as an independent body, and there was not yet any mention of civil society being involved in the process. As the drafting went on, the EU, which negotiated as a single body rather than several different states, Japan and Israel were some of the most involved in creating a new body. The focal point and coordination mechanism, as they are currently in the final draft, became set fairly early in the process. The sticking point for most states was how powerful the monitoring mechanism could be and how involved civil society could be. So in this first draft, there was no mention of the Paris Principles and a much weaker provision for civil society involvement. As the process went on, the NGOs and the national human rights institutions continued to push for much more expansive civil society involvement and much more expansive monitoring. And many states would push back, arguing that too much prescription would be burdensome on them, would be an impossible standard to meet, and was unnecessary. So it kind of came down to a battle between these two forces. And so when you look at the kind of the final product, what you mainly see is a body that was what the states would accept. The focal points were common by that point. Many states are fine with that. The coordination mechanism made sense and was optional, fairly optional in any case. The monitoring mechanism, with its implicit mention of the Paris Principles, was the most independence that most states were comfortable with, and civil society involvement was fought for almost continuously, and Article 33's expansiveness is a result of continuous pushing by national rights institutions and NGOs. So you can see that Article 33 is the result of several kind of unique forces that came together at the time of the drafting of the CRPD, and all those forces were able to push for what is a very unique bridge between domestic and international law, and what is the strongest bridge they could create and what is the strongest bridge that could be created given the political climate at the time. Thank you. We have a bit of time if there are any questions.
If not, okay.
Nope.
Okay. So our second speaker is Birtha. Magdalna is a Marie Curie Research Fellow and PhD candidate here at the Centre. And Magdalna's research is in the frame of the DREAM project and is focusing on national European monitoring of the CRPD and civil society involvement. And she's a special focus on the active and effective involvement of persons with disabilities in policy and decision-making processes. So, whenever you're ready, Magdalna.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mary, for the introduction. Thanks for everybody for coming to our summer school. So today my task is to talk about some innovative practices from around the world. In my research in the DREAM, as Mary said, I'm really focusing on what makes Article 33 work. today I talk a little about this triangular dynamic framework, general challenges when implementing Article 33 based on my empirical data collection from countries in and out of Europe. And I brought some promising practices mentioning strengths and challenges, as I haven't really seen any perfect example in terms of Article 33 implementation, and the empowerment of the disability movement through an African example, and some conclusions and recommendations. So this is what's important, the triangular shape of Article 33, and as Gerard usually says, this triangulation requires a balance of power and functions between those actors. So on one hand, here is the government, the law and policymaker, which ensures accountants for the state, which needs to be in relation with Article 33, two element independent body, the NHRI, which is the watchdog having the traditional experience in doing human rights monitoring. And a very new innovative element, civil society, and especially DPOs, who brings the first-hand experience. It's very important to make the distinction between NGOs and DPOs and not let the common exclusive politics when NGOs, the human rights NGOs, just take the leading role because DPOs are not empowered enough. So it's very important to keep in mind that Article 33 is about the involvement of persons with disabilities and their organizations. So the current situation is that state parties are all in the process which ratify the conventions to establish this Article 33 framework. But the question is what makes this work? Because it's not a static thing, it's very dynamic, and it requires a whole new methods, working collaboration, transparent working methods between the government, NHRI, and civil society, which just haven't been there before. So not even the national human rights institutions work together with the organizations of persons with disabilities. I have been in Moldova lately giving training to government representatives and the Ombudsman Office on Article 33. It was very surprising when the Ombudsman told us that, look, I know I have a responsibility to monitor the CRPD as part of my mandate, but I'm not sure I want to do it together with DPOs and civil society members. And we were quite surprised, saying him like, look, this is written in CRPD. And it's just very shocking when you realize that it's not only the government to whom it's a challenge to implement Article 33 adequately, but it's also a challenge for some of the NHRIs in the state parties. I think that we have such a limited knowledge on the involvement of persons with disabilities to avoid tokenistic presence and to avoid consultations, which often happens that, on paper we see which organizations are entitled to participate in monitoring the CRPD, but actually how do they feel about their involvement? That's a big question, and that's something I'm trying to get when I'm going on field trips and talk to DPOs. The challenges. So one of the challenges is the formal establishment. It happens in many countries that there is a consensus on who is the Article 32 body, the independent element, but there was no formal designation, which is problematic because how much a government will consider, the work of such a body if it's not formally designated in law. The second challenge I bring today is the inclusion of the Paris Principle compliant element. It sounds easy because, we have a list which are A, B, or C status NHRIs in the country. But in fact, as some examples show, the government is not really thinking about including this element. For instance, in Hungary, what happened was that there was an excellent, I'm from Hungary, so it's my home country, and I'm particularly sensitive what's happening there, that they merged the Ombudsman Office, and now we have an Ombudsman for Fundamental Rights, right? And in its mandate in the law, it says that it is the NPM for the OPCAT. However, it does not designate it as Article 33.2 body, even if Hungary ratified the convention back in 2007. It says that the Ombudsman shall pay particular attention to activities around CRPD monitoring, but this is not a designation in my understanding. The adequate funding provided for the activities of the framework, where this funding should come from, as was raised before in the question, is very important. The sustainability. So what I see that around the first reporting process, even if it's quite clear, the question how much the framework and DPOs can keep up the good work which was put together And it highly depends, especially in developing countries, as you will see in later examples, on where this money is coming from. If there is no internal money and the money is from, like the European Union or other international organizations, donors, like what if the money is gone and who will monitor the implementation of the convention afterwards? The development of these new accessible working methods, yeah, it's very important. As the NHRI and civil society, you need to see they bring different experiences to the table, and it's very important to develop this new relation between them. Systematic monitoring is very challenging. So if you think about the CRPD, how many issues are covered in the convention, it's very challenging to ensure that it's really monitored in a systematic manner. The balanced participation of civil society, so who represents civil society and who is not there, whose voice is not heard, because what we usually see, those organizations are the ones who have the chance to represent themselves, and it's very, very interesting, and it links the whole family organizations who claim to be DPOs because they feel they are covered under the convention, and also within the movement, it's very heterogeneous movement. So if you think about the deaf community, part of the deaf community I met in some countries, advocate for segregated education. Some other parts of the deaf movement in the same country advocated for, inclusive education in line with the CRPD. So it's very, very important to see the whole broad picture when we talk about disability or organizations' involvement. And transparency, it doesn't appear there, but the last line is transparency, which is very important. So my first example I brought you today is Australia, which ratified the convention in 2008. They have a dual focal point, the Attorney General's Department, which brings the legal, the justice aspect, and the other one is the Department of Families, Housing, Community Services and Indigenous Affairs, which rather brings this social welfare approach. The Article 33.2 framework, so the Australian Human Rights Commission and especially the Disability Discrimination Commissioner is considered as Article 33.2, but as you will see, one of the challenges of this framework that at the end it's not formally designated, and it causes some difficulties. So that's why I think it's important to look at the practice, because on paper, like the Australian framework looks so great, but if you go there and talk to the people, they are not happy about the lack of the designation, for instance. The Article 33, I just put here People with Disability Australia, which is the big umbrella DPO, and the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. So some of the strength of the mechanism, as I see, is that government recognizes the CRPD and its own obligations under it. It does not mean that it's doing everything right, but when I was at the Attorney General office, I was happy to hear that they take well the criticism from the National Human Rights Institution and from civil society, and they know that this is the way to go and work together. It sounds something which should be normal, but if you go to Eastern European countries, and I guess to so many other parts of the world, the government is not receptive at all, to the criticism of civil society. So I already put it here as a positive aspect in the Australian case. There is a great and regular working relation between the actors, which is very important, I think. And maybe, the fact that the NHRI, Graham Innes, who is the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, he's coming from the movement. So maybe that's one of the reasons that it's easier in that case to maintain everyday connection between the NHRI and civil society when doing the monitoring work together. And the shadow report, as you may have heard before, was an extensive, 3 years process with a broad collaboration, and it's considered really as one of the promising practices. So the challenge is, as I said, the lack of formal designation, the fact that no additional funding was provided to the Australian Human Rights Commission. So actually, they don't do any CRPD monitoring in a systematic way. They do their regular activities, and of course, some of them falls under CRPD monitoring, but it's important to see that CRPD monitoring as such is not happening because there is no additional funding guaranteed by anybody. And if you start talking to advocates, like persons with disabilities who work for PWDA are not satisfied with the level of their involvement in government policymaking. They say it's rather tokenistic than actually meaningful. The second example is New Zealand, which also ratified the convention in 2008. And the focal point is the Office for Disability Issues. They also have a coordination mechanism, the Ministerial Committee on Disability Issues. And their Article 33 framework consists of 3 elements: the Human Rights Commission, the Ombudsman, and the Convention Coalition, which is a group of DPOs funded by the government. For me, the New Zealand example is the best looking CRPD compliant Article 33.2 framework. It looks like how it's written in the convention. The government is willing to harmonize the work of the different ministerial departments to use better the limited resources. And there is a commitment, and I say it after talking to several ministerial representatives, to make a change. And they even fund the Convention Coalition, which is very interesting. Is it good or not if the government funds, the group of DPOs to be able to participate in the work of the monitoring framework? It's a big question. In New Zealand, several people told me that they are happy to get this fund, and the government is not really, telling them what to do, so they really feel independent and using this money at their best capacity. The challenge is, however, that there is no systematic monitoring happening under this framework neither. So I met with members of if you're interested, I can tell you the list of DPOs who are part of this Convention Coalition. They said, look, we seriously don't remember the last time when we had a meeting, or sometimes we get an email, or, it's not really happening. And this is very concerning because on paper, this is really one of the best mechanisms, invented in the world. And some member organizations were not even aware of any functions, but most of them knew that this exists in the country. The Indigenous people with disabilities, I think it's a very concerning issue in New Zealand. I met with members of the Maori disability community, and they don't feel part of the whole monitoring thing, but they don't feel anyway included in the whole convention. It's partly because the individual collective rights issue, that what the CRPD offers is not, Indigenous people cannot really apply those individual rights in their communities, which I think is also very interesting when we talk about monitoring, to see those very specific regional issues. And last, I don't know how many minutes I have left.
About 3 or 4.
3 or 4, great. So Zambia. In Zambia, the convention was ratified in 2010. As you see, the focal point is the Minister of Community Development, which is in the process to reappoint focal points, and they want to switch to several focal point system. But I think what's interesting is that the Independent Monitoring Unit, which is supposed to be the Article 33 framework, was established as an initiative of civil society DPO. So the government didn't do anything to start, designating an independent mechanism. So civil society took the leading role. It raises another question regarding Article 33, how far we can take nothing about us without us, and how, is it great if civil society persons with disabilities and their organizations become policy owners or not? It's very concerning. However, so I'm not using this as a good example for Article 33.2, but I tend to use it as a good example for the empowerment of the disability movement and active civil society presence. I do think the strengths are that the civil society there is using the CRPD as an advocacy tool. They go to small villages with copies of the CRPD, easy to read, braille, large print, to tell the people what's going on. They are quite active in legal reviews, and they ask the opinion of the local communities, of their member organization, what to put in submissions. And they do awareness raising a lot. However, the challenge is, as I mentioned in the introduction, that really, so this is funded by Power International and European Union. And if the money is gone, what do they do? And I got criticism when, it was not a criticism, but a constructive question, like, how do you evaluate that, they got this extra money, but if you go there and talk to the people, they had no chance to get government money or any other internal money. It's a very poor country, so the GDP is like around 1,600 euros, and just a comparison with Germany, where it's like 57,000. It's a massive gap. So how would you ensure in developing countries to implement and monitor the convention? So I still do think that it's a good example that it was their initiative, as they felt that there is a need to do something. And it's very interesting that in the IMU, however, the Human Rights Commission, which is an A-status NHRI in the country, is formally part of it. But practically, they don't have any relations. So the Human Rights Commission is just practically left out from the monitoring work. Very interesting, I think. And here are some of my conclusions. So the government shall formally designate an Article 33.2 framework, including one or more independent elements. Independent funding should be provided for members of the framework to carry out systematic monitoring work. And the work of this framework should be regularly monitored, because it often happens that it's established, it's operating on a certain base, and people are not satisfied with it. DPOs are not satisfied with it. The NHRI doesn't really know what to do, and it's just not. But the question is, who should monitor the work of this framework? And I guess the CRPD committee's feedback is very important, but it's just, I think, very important question. And the meaningful participation of persons with disabilities should be guaranteed. And it's very difficult for me, empirically, to measure what is effective participation and not just like, active consultation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.